Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
He'll be speaking from right about here, though. Test.
Last time I did this, I let the speaker talk for a whole hour and not have any power on, so I wanted to be sure that it's not my fault again that any word is missed throughout this evening's lecture. I'd like to welcome you all on this very chilly, cold night to our World Affairs lecture and invite you to pick up one of the green brochures that describes the activities that are left in the rest of our week, and I'll also remind you that next Wednesday, the 14th, Undersecretary General to the United Nations Nara Simon will be coming in conjunction with this institute. And I invite you to attend his lecture, which will be a Wednesday evening, December 14th. Tomorrow evening, the Sri Lankan ambassador, Ambassador Kanakaratne, will be our lecturer for Thursday evening. I would just like to mention that this afternoon, Eleanor Zelliot from Carleton College in Minnesota presented a very interesting and informative slide lecture with commentary. And she also then will be giving some commentary and remarks after Dr. Singh presents his formal remarks this evening. A few words about Dr. Singh. He is currently at the City University of New York, and he is a native of Punjab, India. And he's also presently a member of the political science faculty at City College, the City University of New York. Before teaching, Dr. Singh served in the Indian diplomatic missions to the United Nations at Geneva and New York. He is currently working on a second publication, Minority Cultures, Discord and Harmony, which focuses on national minorities in South Asia. Besides teaching, he is active in minority affairs and literary writing and is the founding fellow of the Skew Renaissance Institute, New York, and chief editor of its monthly journal. Without further ado, then I'd like to introduce Dr. Singh.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure, indeed a privilege for me to be amongst you this evening and to have an opportunity to share my thoughts on minorities in South Asia. Coming from a very small town in a remote corner of South Asia and having become a refugee amongst millions of them, it was a long quest to rediscover our identity and to resurrect our dignity. It was not easy, to say the least. In fact, it was very difficult and a long struggle, and in a way, a struggle or a tryst with destiny, to borrow Jawaharlal Nehru's phrase. While speaking on minorities, the first question which comes to one's mind is how to define a minority. The very rich and the very privileged people are a small minority in every country. They are also a very small minority in South Asia. The poor peasants, underprivileged and dispossessed masses of people, the outcast or the untouchables, they are a vast majority in South Asia. In fact, one of the most alarming facts of today's world, perhaps ultimately more menacing than nuclear overkill, is the gross disparity of material wealth between the poor majority and the rich minority. Almost 2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher Plato observed that even in the smallest city, there are two cities, a city of the rich and a city of the poor, eternally at war with each other. If we don't recall Plato, many people would believe it was Karl Marx. But in fact, these observations were made much earlier. Now again, coming back to the minorities, there are two broad categories that we can determine which minority we are dealing with. One would be based on socioeconomic and class-based factors. The other, identification based on ethnocultural identification. The focus of my presentation this evening is on the second category, the ethnocultural minorities in South Asia. While analytical importance of class-based socioeconomic identifications in the modern industrial societies cannot be minimized, ethnocultural identities still remain powerful catalytic agents in group mobilization. It is more true in the South Asian setting, where religious pluralism is a basic feature of group identity. In fact, major political cleavages occur along ethnocultural lines, and affinities of basic loyalty tend to be separated rather sharply by religious, language, and cultural values. Therefore, the reference in this presentation to ethnocultural identities encompasses language, religion, ethnicity, culture. The emphasis varies from time to time, but more often, religion may be the most critical variable in ethnocultural identifications. Nathan Glaser and Daniel Moynihan, in a very perceptive study, made some interesting observations. One of them is that where ethnocultural identities were formerly seen as survivals from an earlier age, as something tribal, as something provincial, to be treated variously with tolerance, annoyance, or mild celebration, there is now a growing sense that they may be forms of social life that are capable of renewing and transforming themselves. Therefore, they find a very surprising persistence of the ethnic-based forms of social identification as well as conflict. Marxists believed that ethnic groups would disappear. But more often than not, ethnic identities involve a certain disadvantage or an advantage. And at the same time, these are the ethnic groups through which we human beings can overcome those disadvantages. This may be troublesome both to those who wish to emphasize the primacy of class and those who wish to emphasize the primacy of a nation. Nevertheless, the ethnocultural diversity is so important. Let us have a look at the magnitude of the ethnocultural diversity in South Asia. South Asia, the second most populous region of the world, next only to China, is inhabited by the people of different religions, cultures, languages, and races. The subcontinent is rich in cultural diversity, but poor in material resources relative to the population, which is increasing pretty fast, despite very ambitious family planning programs, especially in India. This complex multinational and polyethnic subcontinent is politically divided into four major territorial states: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Ceylon or Sri Lanka, where three main religions dominate: Hinduism in India, Islam in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and Buddhism in Sri Lanka. Each of these religions constitute a minority in one or the other territorial state in the area. India, where Hinduism is preponderant, with 460 million followers constituting almost 83% of total population, has a large Muslim minority of approximately 60 million, which is 11% of India's total population. Besides, there are other religious minorities in India, roughly 16 million Christians, 12 million Sikhs, 5 million Buddhists, 3 million Jains, and other smaller communities like Parsis, the Jews, the Anglo-Indians, and the tribals. There are almost 85 million untouchables. They constitute 18% of India's total population. Looking across the frontier, Pakistan has small Christian and Hindu minorities, but a large and more volatile Pashtun minority, also known as Pathans. Roughly about 10 million of them concentrated in northwestern tribal areas of Pakistan, demanding a separate homeland or Pakhtunistan. Bangladesh has a large Hindu minority, about 10 million, constituting 9% of the total population, and much smaller Christian and Buddhist minorities. In Sri Lanka, where almost 65% of the people profess Buddhist faith, who constitute the Sinhalese-speaking majority, has a Hindu Tamil-speaking minority of about 11% and a Christian minority of about 9%. I'm using these figures based on 1971-72 census, but applying the escalation during last 4 years. Now, most modern states are polyethnic. You may be surprised that out of about 149 members of the UN, only 14 states are monoethnic. And even there are small pockets of minorities. Competition and conflict among individuals and the groups is as old as human history, but the magnitude of this phenomena has assumed new dimensions in recent times. The changing social technology, fast means of communications, and visual mass media have transformed this world into a global village. As such, many problems traditionally within the domestic jurisdiction of a nation often spill over the national frontiers and assume international ramifications. Now, the subject of polyethnicity and multinational character, the subject is so vast and complex, the historical raw material quite voluminous, and we have observed this disturbing phenomena of ethno-cultural conflict long enough. Now we must outline conceptual devices and determine the parameters for the resolution of this conflict. The following hypotheses are suggested. 1, the struggle of the minorities for preservation of their distinct ethno-cultural identity and independent growth is not necessarily incompatible with the territorial integrity of a country. On the contrary, it may be the lack of recognition of the rights of a minority and arrogance of a majority which might intensify the conflict. Bangladesh is a classic example of that. Even though Bangladesh had a larger population than West Pakistan, but in analytical terms, when a small minority can oppress a large majority, we assign it a status of a minority in terms of power configuration. In this perspective, the white minority regime in South Africa and Southern Rhodesia placed the black majority in a situation of minority. Two, the psychological dimensions of the conflict in terms of the divergence of perceptions may often be more critical and dangerous in certain situations than even the socio-economic and political factors. Third, the fear of extinction perceived by a minority and the lack of sensitivity, including absence of empathy on the part of a majority, can be a crucial factor in breaking the bonds of coexistence. These divergent perceptions often lead to endless human misery, dislocation of population, and viable political and economic units are broken up. Four, depending upon social systems' capacity to absorb these shocks and to deal with the ethnocultural problems and the quality of its performance in terms of conflict resolution can lead to one of the following consequences. One, there can be the partition of the country based on mutual agreement, which could be tacit or formal. It might involve some violence, but basically it's mutual agreement. The second consequence could be, it can be a disintegration of an existing state as a consequence of a violent and bloody war involving enormous loss of human life, property, and material resources. The third consequence can be the recognition of a genuine rights of a minority and try to rectify the imbalance. Now, South Asia provides a kind of workshop experience of all these consequences, in the sense that the basic problem is to try to manage the conflict. Now, in the first category, I said one of the consequences of an ethno-cultural conflict can be the partition of a country. And that is what happened in South Asia back in 1947. Although the roots of this cultural conflict can be traced back in history, but the legacy of contemporary minority problem is traced back to the colonial rule and national movement for independence. This movement culminated in the partition of the subcontinent, which was a single geopolitical unit under the British rule. During the independence movement, more or less all the communities in this multi-religious, multilingual, and multiracial society participated together and invested their fortune in a shared future, full of dreams and aspirations. At one point, the entire country was awakened under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi and people belonging to different communities, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, and Parsis, all followed the Mahatma in a struggle for independence. But then the tragic event followed. There was a chasm in the national movement. And the major factor again was ethno-cultural conflict between Islam and Hinduism, where the Muslims demanded a separate homeland for the Muslim majority. There was no war, but there was quite a bit of violence and bloodshed. And eventually, the long-cherished independence came to the subcontinent with a mixed blessing. The joys of freedom were tempered by the scars of partition, communal rights, and bloodshed. Colonialism took a bon voyage, leaving these countries torn into pieces and bleeding. Since then, minority politics have been central issues in India, Pakistan, and Ceylon. In a way, Pakistan was created to resolve one minority problem. It did not resolve it. In fact, the partition of India and creation of Pakistan and mass migration of minorities from both sides of the frontier aggravated the ethno-cultural conflict and intensified the minority problem rather than resolving it. While Muslims accomplished their dream of a national homeland with a dominant Muslim majority of 65 million. This is a figure back in 1947. But more than 45 million Muslims stayed back in India. The Kashmir problem was another outcome of the tragic partition of the subcontinent in 1947. In this regard, Nehru, in his discovery of India, made an observation: some kind of dream of unity has occupied the mind of India since the dawn of civilization. This was probably Nehru's ideal dream. But the realities took a different direction, in the sense where there was one British India, now there are 4 countries. But despite partitions, India did not declare Hinduism as a state religion. Indian National Congress, in conformity with its long-standing ideological commitment, continued a secular philosophy, a secular policy, where different religious communities could enjoy the freedom. In fact, Congress Party government, despite the partition, included prominent nationalist Muslims like Maulana Azad, Rafi Ahmed Kidwai, and Shah Nawaz Khan in the central cabinet. The Constitution of Indian Republic contains elaborate safeguards for the minorities. It prohibits discrimination based on religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth. It prohibits discrimination in public employment. It abolishes untouchability, guarantees freedom of religion, so on and so forth. And therefore, the secular philosophy reflects in the constitutional guarantees. It may, however, be pointed out that the constitutional provisions and legal norms are significant point of reference, but political realities often diverge not only from the language, but also the spirit of the Constitution. While the Congress Party remained committed to secularism, discrimination based on religion and interference in the religious affairs of the minorities has been a common feature at local levels, even though the national policy was not in that direction. Sir Ivor Jennings is of the opinion that the Congress Party leaders have minimized the importance of minority interest. In the absence of institutional framework, that there were provisions in the Constitution, but there was no institutional framework to safeguard the minority interest. Fortunately, in India, where Hindu culture is preponderant, it has the tradition of religious tolerance, flexibility, and acceptance of diversity. It is a common pattern of political institutions which have deep impact of Hindu culture to be less dogmatic. The process may be slow, but Hinduism is open to change and often absorbs the shocks and the stresses. Some people suspect the Hindu prudence and flexibility as a very shrewd strategy to outflank the adversary rather than confront it openly. As they say that somebody asked Nehru whether India would go communist once you are gone. And Nehru said, gee, I cannot tell you that, but I can tell you one thing. If India goes communist, that would be end of communism. You know, that is a reference to the flexibility of Hindu culture. That it's true that Hindu culture doesn't fight, but it outflanks. And Nehru's indication was that it can outflank even communism, that it will lose its vitality or radicalism once it is there in India. In a wider regional perspective, Muslim minority in India is not only numerically strong, its power is enhanced because of the Hindu minority in Pakistan as well. Political leaders cannot ignore that any ill treatment of the Muslim minority in India can be retaliated by Pakistan over the Hindu minority. Now, when we make a reference to Pakistan, there are two periods in time and space. There was a large Muslim minority in Pakistan, but after the breakaway of Bangladesh, now there is a large Hindu minority in Bangladesh rather than in Pakistan. And there are countervailing forces in the sense that in all these areas there are minorities. In a way, minorities provide cushion to each other. And therefore, these are kind of countervailing forces. Nevertheless, the Muslim minority has had to make some difficult emotional adjustment. The Indian Muslims have had to learn to regard his co-religionist in Pakistan as a foreigner. The Hindu neighbor, a fellow citizen with whom he must take up arms, if need be, against the Pakistanis. Even this radical psychological reorientation, if achieved, may not be enough to ensure him the goodwill of the majority. On the other side of the frontier, in Pakistan, the Hindu minority also had to make similar emotional adjustment. In view of the conflict relations between the two countries, it was not easy for the Muslims in India to take up arms against Pakistan and vice versa. In Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, which attained independence quite painlessly as a byproduct of India's freedom struggle, the Buddhist majority, 65% of the total population, constitutes a vital component of the national life. The Tamil-speaking Hindu minority and Sinhalese-speaking Buddhist majority often fought many battles over the language issue, over citizenship, and of course, underlying currents were economic and social. Nevertheless, the Sinhalese-speaking Buddhist majority is a dominant factor in national life in Ceylon. I had previously mentioned that as a consequence of this minority-majority conflict, if the system has the capacity to resolve this conflict or not, depending upon its efficiency, three consequences could follow. I'll briefly discuss some of those. The first instance I mentioned, that as a consequence of dominant Hindu majority and a vulnerable Muslim minority in India when it was united, it brought a chasm in the national movement. As a result, the country was partitioned. But despite the partition, the problem could not be resolved. It became more intensified. The next stage came that both within India as well as within Pakistan, there were separatist tendencies. I mentioned already that a small but volatile Pathan minority in Pakistan is seeking self-determination and threatening territorial integrity of Pakistan. On the other side, East Pakistan and West Pakistan, even though it was the same Islamic culture, but there are other diversity in terms of language, race, their way of living, and a long physical distance in the two wings, which eventually broke the union apart. But in this case, there was a violent breakdown of communication, and only as a consequence of a long, bloody warfare, Pakistan was dismembered into two, and Bangladesh emerged as a new country. This was a third offshoot of the British Empire. Even that doesn't resolve all the problems. Within India, I would cite two major examples which threaten the territorial integrity of India because of the ethno-cultural conflict. One was in Punjab, and the other, what we call it, Nagaland, and how the Indian political system try to deal with both these situations. In Punjab, the Sikh community happened to be, before creation of a Punjabi-speaking state, a minority which was roughly about 30%. But ever since the fall of the Sikh Commonwealth back in 1848, the Sikhs have been carrying on a struggle to re-establish their national identity. During the time, the Muslims demanded a separate homeland. The Sikhs also talked in terms of a separate Sikh state, but the idea was not pushed very far. However, after the partition of the country, when Congress, in terms of its commitment, established a commission to reorganize the states based on language, the purpose was to make each state as possible as a unilingual. Now, when those states the lines were redrawn, the Sikh community in Punjab demanded a separate unilingual Punjab. Even though the main controversy was over language, but basically the Sikh community was looking for a place where they could be in a dominant majority. The problem was that the demand of a small minority, which was roughly about 30%, there was a problem how to translate it into action. Even those members of the Congress who were sympathetic, they would tell the Sikh community, look here, you are a small minority. 70% Hindus in Punjab don't want that. Well, eventually, it was a long struggle spread over 20 years. But what is more significant about this struggle, that eventually, after 20 years, the Sikhs accomplished and achieved their demand, that the Punjabi-speaking state has been created, but it was a long struggle, but no major loss of human life, no major loss of property, no loss of material resources, in the sense that it was more or less a semi-non-violent struggle. Yet, ultimately, the objective was achieved. That was that a minority's basic demand was recognized without breaking India. That means India's territorial integrity was kept, and at the same time, a minority's demand has been granted. And this way, India took care of the vulnerability or the fear of who lived in the outer fringes of the modern civilization were a distinct tribal group. During the British time, they enjoyed complete freedom. These are the people who do not have the modern comforts, who do not have the material benefits. They are not literate in terms of modern education, but they love their freedom. As New India tried to establish its control in the outer fringes, particularly when there was a border dispute with China, the problem was how to bring these Nagas into the mainstream of Indian life. As the Indian administration tried to extend itself, the Nagas resented. As a result, there was a long, violent struggle. The Nagas trying to keep their freedom and not let the Indian administration interfere. At the same time, the Indian system trying to extend its jurisdiction in this kind of no man's land. Now, this was another example where even though there was a loss of human life, there was a long struggle, violence was involved. Nevertheless, the political system resolved this problem within certain parameters, maintaining the integrity of India, yet eventually meeting the Nagas halfway, granting them autonomy, eventually asking Nagas to elect their own representatives, to form a government, recognizing their complete autonomy and respecting their sensitivity, that why they would love freedom more than modern comforts, modern schools, modern hospitals. And that sensitivity was recognized. This again is an indication of the health of a system, that in any multi-ethnic, multicultural society, the conflict is inherent, but the question is whether the system can absorb that stress. The Indian political system tried to deal with these. On one end, with more or less in a non-violent way. And the other side, in the Nagaland, they created a separate state. So in a way, these are just two examples. The separatist tendencies amongst the Sikhs in Punjab and the freedom-loving Nagas. In both cases, the situation has been at least resolved within the territorial integrity of India. In case of Pakistan, I mentioned one example where initially there was a demand for autonomy in East Pakistan. That demand could not properly be processed. As a result, the things went out of control. As a result of bloodshed and violence, eventually Pakistan was dismembered. That shows, in a way, it's not a value judgment, that shows the capacity of a system to absorb the shock, to deal with the stress. In case of Pakhtunistan, the demand by a 10 million Pathan minority for a separate homeland, there are certain analogies between Nagaland and Pakhtunistan. Both are tribal people. Both are freedom-loving. Both live away from the fringes of modern civilization. Both would resent modern comforts but try to keep their independence. Again, the government of Pakistan tried in a similar way as initially India tried to do, to extend its jurisdiction in kind of area which was no man's land. And the Pathans, they retaliated. Now the problem is still there. It's premature to say whether the Bangladesh model would repeat in Pakhtunistan or whether, based on earlier experience, the political system in Pakistan would be able to resolve the conflict in Pakhtunistan and maintain the territorial integrity of Pakistan. I did mention earlier, I suggested that the recognition of the rights of minority within certain parameters need not necessarily be incompatible with territorial integrity of any state. There are two paradoxical developments in modern time. On the one hand, in Western Europe, we see the old adversaries, Germany, France, Britain, and other countries, finding it functionally useful to integrate. In Asia and Africa, we are facing another development, that where the existing units are breaking up. Now, even centuries past, when India was not a unified political unit, it was a compact economic unit, in the sense that the people could move freely across the subcontinent. Or to use the modern concept, that the goods and services could move across the subcontinent freely. Now we have created artificial barriers, which in a way stand in the way of economic development and is not beneficial to any of these countries which emerged from the British Empire. Now, often the dangers are in this kind of ethno-cultural conflict, if it is not resolved, that there is generally the behavior pattern of the ethnic minorities in certain situations resembles the behavior pattern of many small states. Prolonged non-resolution of an inter-ethnic conflict might involve external intervention. As for instance, it happened when there was an internal conflict between West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Eventually, India's intervention proved to be a critical factor. convergence of interethnic tension into a conflict of international magnitude. This highlights the importance of any political system trying to resolve interethnic conflict. On the one hand, there is a feeling that the minorities or nationalities are a kind of irritant within a system because they create political instability. Soviet scholar and Nobel Prize winner Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he says that ethnic minorities are the wealth of humanity. They are its crystallized personalities. Even the smallest among them has its own special colors and hides within itself a particular facet of God's design. And therefore, he says, these should be encouraged. These forces of multicultural nature can neither be wished away nor steamrolled to non-existence. These new political systems, which are polyethnic, have to work out a modus vivendi to reconcile the two conflicting but valid claims. The quest of a national minority for the recognition and maintenance of its distinct identity at the vertical level has to be reconciled with the struggle of a preponderant majority to maintain the territorial integrity at the horizontal level. Political innovations may have to be worked out in the forms of loose federations, confederacies, and commonwealth, where national minorities would enjoy freedom in their own little ethnocultural republics, while remaining an integral part of the larger commonwealth. It may not provide a universal solution, but polyethnic federalism is a possible way of easing interethnic tensions. Nationalism often becomes synonymous with the dominant culture, and even genuine demands of minorities are labeled as parochial. That is the danger. Communal or even anti-national. Therefore, national mechanism for conflict resolution should be supplemented by an impartial arbiter to avoid the conflict situation reaching a point of no return. Some kind of international recognition of the minority rights and establishment of an institutional mechanism is needed, so the minorities' grievances could find an outlet. Often there is a communication problem, that the communication between a minority and majority breaks down. This proposed international mechanism or an agency should have the authority to hear complaints, receive petitions from the minorities, and to investigate and publish reports and make recommendations. It is kind of a middle level, not the authority to dictate, but to make recommendations to the respective governments. It would alert the ruling regimes and dominant majorities in respect of their obligation towards minorities and provide a psychological sense of security to the minorities. This proposal for international recognition of the rights of national minorities is not an entirely new idea. The Treaty of Berlin in 1878 contained clauses relating to protection of minorities. Under the League of Nations, all newly created states in East Central Europe, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Poland, were induced to sign the so-called minority treaties. The purpose of these treaties was to protect national minorities against discrimination and assimilation. Besides, special sections were inscribed in the peace treaties with Austria, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Turkey, again relating to the protection of minorities. The observance of the obligations enshrined in these treaties depended basically upon the good faith of these countries. Therefore, there is a need to supplement with the international institutions as a part of the UN that which could oversee the treatment of minorities. In a way, it might somewhat limit the role of majority in different ethnocultural situations, but at the same time, it might save the breakdown in the existing states, where the internal conflict might reach a point of no return. And there is a major danger in South Asia that if these various forces of separatism, of disintegration, cannot be taken care of within the parameters of these systems, there may be more partitions in offense, which would involve greater loss of human life, major economic, social, and cultural dislocation, which in a way must be avoided. But in case I pictured a kind of too gloomy a profile of South Asia, let me add a note of optimism at the end, and that is that it appears that God takes care of South Asia. And even communists have acknowledged that. They say that some 20 years ago, the first cultural delegation came to India from Soviet Union. When they arrived at the Palam airport in New Delhi, it was raining very heavily. In India, either it doesn't rain or it rains too heavily. And the plane could not land. And they diverted the plane to another airport, which was 300 miles away. And then they put the delegation in a train, and the train broke down. And all the arrangements for reception had to be changed. And then, they were to meet a minister of culture, and his car broke down on the way. And a couple of times they were caught up in an elevator, even though we have very few elevated buildings. Well, during 2 weeks of their stay in India, they had many kind of mishaps like that. When they were going back, the journalist, as usual, went to the airport, saying them goodbye, and one of them asked Madam, she was the Minister of Culture of Soviet Union, I forgot her name. She said, Madam, that's right. She said, Madam, what was your experience of visiting India? She said, well, people are very nice, they have been very hospitable, it's a great country and we enjoy. And one of them said, well, that's all fine, but tell us something real. Hospitality, nice, and all that. And she said, oh, you want something real? Okay, wait a minute. She said, we are communist. We really don't believe in God. But after 2 weeks in India, I keep thinking, there must be some God here, otherwise who takes care of this country? Okay. So this is just in clarification that God takes care of us. Beg your pardon?
Of children, drunks, and Indians.
That's right. Well, this is all I had to say, and I'll welcome any questions.
I have one question.
Okay.
You refer to the ethno-culture of India. This statement that one hand, I think the article in the commentary uses this term for the first time for the assertion of the Jewish state. The terminology is, I don't know how much is appropriate for Indian situation subcontinent. I don't think Hindus or Muslims in any way are ethnically different. I doubt very much a South Indian Muslim is more of a Hindu than a North Indian Hindu. That is my feeling. I am a South Indian essentially. When I travel north, I feel these Hindus are much more like Muslims than my Muslims there. So, if religion is culture, it is quite difficult to call Indian subcontinent subdivisions as ethno-cultural.
Good question. Often when we determine two different categories, either class-based or ethnoculture, they might overlap. However, particularly referring to the word ethnicity, Now, the word ethno is derived from Greek, which means there are different translations. In modern usage, they use them as a people, a nation, a country, in the sense that anything which gives a people a peoplehood. Therefore, the term ethnicity is a kind of elusive. Many people identify it with race, but it has nothing to do with race. But basic, whatever may be crucial in a given situation, whether religion, language, or culture, and in certain situations, all of them may be combined. Like, for instance, the basic conflict between the Buddhist majority in Ceylon and the Tamil-speaking Hindu minority was on the surface over language. But undercurrent was that small community of the Christians and the Hindu minority, Tamil-speaking, were occupying positions of prominence in Ceylon. But later on, the Sinhalese-speaking Buddhist majority used Buddhism as a slogan, that Buddhism is the mainstream of Ceylonese life. And therefore, but the basic problem was economic and social. In case of India, it's true that it's a kind of mixture of many races. However, in certain situations, religion happens to be the dominant critical factor in determining the ethnicity of a certain people. It's true that Punjabi Muslims may have more common with me than the South Indian Muslims with a Punjabi Muslim. But nevertheless, in this case, at a given time in history, religion became a critical factor and it disintegrated India. And therefore, the term ethnocultural is being used very widely, in which case either language or religion happens to be critical. Now, in case of the Sikhs' demand for autonomy in Punjab, the controversy started over language, but language was only a camouflage. Basically, the Sikhs were looking for a place where they could be in a majority, and they used the language as a tool to accomplish a certain goal. And that was when Nehru told the Sikhs, that you are a small 30% minority. I sympathize with you, but how can I do it? Because 70% Hindus, they are scared that if you people, are in a majority, you would squeeze them out. And the answer was, look here, we are only 30%, and we are not scared of you. If we are only 51%, why the Hindus should be scared of us? And eventually, as a result of long struggle, Master Tara Singh and Akali Party used language as a camouflage. I'm using the word figuratively. But the basic purpose was to have a place where the Sikhs could be in a majority. So therefore, I'm saying it depends in a certain time and space, either language or religion or culture can be a critical factor. If tomorrow we try to unify India, then we would say that there is some vague concept of the Indian culture. That is in Nehru's discovery of India, that a dream, that dream is there. It's an ideal. It can be realized, but a lot of homework has to be done. I mean, there is a chance that the whole of Indian subcontinent can reunite again while remaining the distinct political unit as they are, but in functional terms like what is being done in Western Europe. And then you can call that there's a kind of dream of common Indian culture. Then religion and language becomes less important, but the dominant Indian culture becomes preponderant. But right now we talk in terms of Islamic culture, because in that case, religion is dominant. Just again, it's a question of time and space.
That is why I said instead of defining minorities as an ethno-cultural entity,
Right?
the minority is an extremely fluid term. If you want to call cultural, American blacks, I don't think are culturally different from the American whites. Now, if you exclude to mean race and ethnic, then American blacks are not different ethnically also. But they claim themselves to be a minority.
Right.
Let's take Mexicans. Okay, in American background. In Indian background, it is much less. Really speaking, we are neither culturally different nor ethnically different in whatever term ethnicity is interpreted. Indeed, it is true of the whole of South Asia.
It
Or
dep-
culturally, I think a Bengali, whether Eastern or Western, culturally feel so akin to each other, even now. Even now, with the military regime there and the city Basur regime here, they feel cultural identity so much more closer than with any one of us.
You know, it depends how closer we are looking at a situation. Even amongst the small Sikh community, there is a cultural diversity, the Jats and non-Jats. And in people who know them very closely, you can see and recognize a Jat and a non-Jat. But all of them wear a turban, they have a beard, they speak the same language. So I'm saying these are kind of the subtleties of an analytical categories that we establish. I introduced an hypothesis saying that certain group identifications survive, that either we suffer certain disadvantages by being a Mexican, by being a black, by being an Italian, by being a Sikh or a Muslim, and therefore we form a group that we fight to overcome those disadvantages. And that's why these identities survive at a given time, either because we suffer certain disadvantages or we are carrying on a struggle to overcome those disadvantages and mobilize our strength as a group identity. So once again, whether it's a sociologist or political scientist or an international scholar, it depends from which perspective we are looking at it. To me, as a student of international politics, ethnocultural conflict is the most explosive situation in many countries than even the nuclear energy. Because it is this ethnocultural conflict, if not taken care of, that it can explode and break the countries. And once again, how do you make these identification? It depends upon situation. Again, one or the other factor can dominate, and at a different situation it can disappear. Language may be dominant in Ceylon in a certain time and space. It can disappear after 10 years. And then the economic class-based categories might become more important in any kind of conflict. Any other?
I'm dying to say something, but do stay here. I'm an Indianist and often go to India, and I think one thing that appeals to Americans is the variety. We come from our rather monochromatic culture, and we see a Sikh in an orange shirt, an orange turban, and orange socks, and we think, oh boy, that's great. Or we see a naked Jain priest striding proudly down the street, followed by a lot of very fat silk sari-clad women, and we think, oh, why isn't life in America like this? Or we see a little Goanese Christian in a miniskirt followed down the street by a completely covered Muslim woman from head to foot. The variety in India is striking, it's open, it's clear, and we have to look at it and we have to think about it. And like so many things in India, it is so clear and so vivid that we really do have to think. And about this idea of a plural society, about ethnic groups based on whatever, language, religion. And I think I would add the word you used very effectively, perception, is something I have been enormously aware of ever since I discovered India in 1951. I can understand the passion of the split in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, where you see a country torn by a religion, cum historical, cum economic, ethnic perception of the difference. You can see Lebanon split in pieces. You can see Canada shaking at times with its French Catholic minority and its perception of its own ill treatment at the hands of the British-based majority. In other words, the visibility of Indian groups makes one very conscious of the passion of and the differentness of ethnic groups, so that one really perceives it more clearly in other countries. I have talked to my Marxist friends about this because I have said, look, how does communism come to a country that is genuinely plural? It hasn't done it yet. Russia, the Soviet Union, is the only communist nation that has large groups that are different. And the Muslims of Central Asia, as far as I know, are totally quiet. I'm just waiting until they outnumber the white Russians in the West, and we can see if a communist state can be truly plural. There does not seem to be Marxist ideology that deals with pluralism and nationality. Like so many other things in India, seeing this very rich life so clearly enables one to take a different look at one's own culture. And I am enormously conscious of two things in American life. One is that our two basic words, integration and majority, work against our perception of the richness and the rights of what you have called minorities or ethnic groups. Carleton College now, which is a small college and one that is basically quite conservative, is in the throes of acceptance of the term third world peoples instead of minority peoples, for blacks, for Asian Americans, for Latinos. And they are very insistent on this, and it is a statement that they are not minorities to a dominant culture. They are people with a perception of their own culture as different and as worthwhile. And they say, of course, there's no blatant racism at Carleton. There's institutionalized racism, and there is no value of a plural society. And I think this word that you used, the minorities as wealth and not as irritant, is perhaps one of the most important of these things. It's not majority rule, perhaps, that we should be so much concerned on, is how do people perceive themselves and how can the marvelous differences of different ethnic groups be seen to add the color and wealth to the American scene, because we do have them that we sometimes see in India. I can't help doing this. I always have to look at the Indian situation and try to understand it and then see what that tells me about the culture that I live in. Thank you very much for talking. I hope that some of our cultural problems can be solved as well as the Nagas and the Sikhs, and that the incredible building up of this into partition is something that a nation goes through perhaps only once, and ever after that learns how to value its minorities and how to cherish cultural differences and how to build a truly plural society. And we'll see if Marxism comes to India who wins.
What happens to it? Thank you. Any other question? Yes, please.
That last comment does raise in my mind this sort of a question in that there is, from a cultural point of view, a great value to diversity, but in many senses, from an economic point of view, there is a great value to uniformity. Communication, not if you have great diversity of languages and the language lines are clearly set, then perhaps your communication is only across at the top levels of a culture, those who are economically advantaged. Whereas in a place like this country, we have communication across the many levels, and this allows the greater rapidity of transfer of certain techniques and technologies in fields such as farming and business over a much larger area, where if you don't have this commonality, it becomes very, very difficult. In his series, The Age of Uncertainty, the author points out that the business community almost worldwide becomes quite uniform linguistically.
You know, the advantage in this situation is that once again, many of these identities do overlap. I did mention that often the problem is to reconcile the vertical identities with the horizontal uniformity. The raw material is the same. It depends how can we use it profitably. In the sense that a country with many different kind of identities can be destroyed if those identities do not contribute to its richness. Or on the other hand, if a country tries to destroy that kind of diversity in order to accomplish a uniformity, it might destroy the country itself. So the problem is that there is certain raw material which is given. We have to use it in the sense that we have there are certain natural forces like fire. We can use it for heating, we can use it for cooking, but we can also burn ourselves in it. Same applies to the water. We can drown in it, but we can use water for many constructive purposes. So similarly, this diversity in any society is a given raw material. And it needs human ingenuity, not only to recognize, but at the same time to appreciate that diversity and to work within that and turn it into a rich material rather than treating it as an irritation, as an annoyance, as something intolerable. Because once again, I'm saying that there are certain forces we cannot wish them away. So therefore, the alternative is to try to use them, recognizing the autonomy of the various segments in a society, but at the same time to integrate those autonomous forces at the horizontal level, keeping the territorial integrity of a country in mind. So there is a kind of reciprocal relationship between a minority culture and a majority culture. Majority culture, its focus is to keep the territorial integrity. Minority culture is more focused on its own identity at the vertical level, which applies in any situation. But the problem is to reconcile both of them. And that depends upon the health, the performance, and the quality of a total culture we call a social culture. And that, I mentioned in case of India, appears to be capable of absorbing these stresses and trying to resolve them. There are two extreme examples of Nagas and Punjab. There have been others. I did not have the time to refer to that. And I just made a contrast in case of Pakistan, where despite having a common religion, Bangladesh broke apart. And that means that diversity could not be integrated, or the system could not benefit despite the unity at horizontal level. That unity was a common Islamic culture, which was the basic bond. And that most critical variable in nation building became a liability in Pakistan. So the same raw material can be useful factor, it can break the country. Any other question? Okay.
We'd like to thank Dr. Singh and Eleanor Zeliat for your informative comments.